Welcome back to our studios here in Lahore. I'm Hamza Amjad. Now, a US Congressional House panel has issued a subpoena to Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, demanding an explanation for the failure of US Taliban talks. Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Elliot Engel says Khalilzad will appear before the House panel on September the 19th. Meanwhile, in a televised interview, Taliban spokesperson Sohail Shaheen said the group had concluded the peace accord with the US. He said if the Americans withdraw from the deal, a safe exit of US troops from Afghanistan cannot be guaranteed. Peace talks between the United States and the Taliban began last October in Qatar. The discussions were held to end nearly 2 decades of war in Afghanistan. Now, for more on this, we're joined by Hamdullah Hamdard, who's a political analyst from Kabul. Mr. Hamdard, thank you for your time and welcome to Indus News. So first of all, both sides, of course, say they will no longer talk to end the war in Afghanistan. Now, what effect will this have on Afghanistan's presidential elections, do you think?
First of all, I think there will be peace talks restarted very soon, but there are some conditions for that. The Taliban do not have to escalate the violence in killing off the civilians and even the Afghan army, and they have to stop the explosions during the peace talks. Regarding the elections, the presidential elections will definitely have to take place so that we, the Afghan people here in Afghanistan, have a stronger government, and we can have a president who can represent the people of Afghanistan through elections, so that there is a legal government in place and they can negotiate with the Taliban. The statement, one of the statements of Zalmay Khalilzad, in which he had said that nothing will be agreed upon until everything is agreed upon, is very important to understand both by Taliban and the Afghan government. In this statement, he has made it very clear that in the first step of, or the first round of the peace talks, Taliban will have to talk with Zalmay Khalilzad, who is special representative of the US for the Afghan reconciliation. And when they agree, are agreed upon the peace deal that they have with each other, in which they have to talk or agree upon 2 things. One, which is the withdrawal of the US and foreign forces from Afghanistan. Second thing, which is that Taliban will not plan any attacks from Afghanistan to threaten the neighboring countries and international community or other countries like US, UK, and other countries. In the second step, Zalmay Khalilzad was supposed to make Taliban ready or get Taliban to the negotiating table with the Afghan government, which is representing the people of Afghanistan, so that this peace negotiation could succeed. Taliban denied regularly and constantly, and they never accepted to talk with the Afghan government. This was the problem. I mean, the problem they created for themselves was here. They escalated the violence, they increased the attacks, and many civilians and also the foreigners here, they were killed. We can say some examples like the explosion on the Green Village, and then the explosion in Shashtarak area, in which an American was also killed. But for us, it's not only the American that is very important. For us, it is the Afghans, the civilians, whose blood is very important for us.
Well, Mr. Hamdard, I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but I mean, it's even to understand that there were 9 rounds of peace talks, and it would seemingly be that the peace would in fact be imposed in Afghanistan after a decades-long war. So, do politicians in Kabul itself still believe that talks could be revived?
Exactly. Without that, we cannot stop the war. Even if Trump is angry at the Taliban at the moment, that is not a big concern, but it is a concern at the moment. Still a concern, because Taliban will have to change the way they are going on, the way they are moving ahead. If they really have the intention to conclude this peace deal with both the US and the Afghan government, then of course they have to accept to go for the ceasefire during the peace talks, and after that they have to agree to talk with the Afghan government so that we have a stable in long-term peace in Afghanistan, not like the one which was sought for in 1992 during Dr. Najib's regime, which resulted in a very fatal civil war in Afghanistan. I'm sure you all have the information on the civil war of Afghanistan. It was a very destructive war, and we do not, the Afghan people do not want to go for any civil war or to enter any civil war due to the mistakes of the negotiators of this peace deal. The Afghan government is very carefully moving forward to make sure that there is a stable peace in Afghanistan, a durable peace in Afghanistan with the Taliban, and they are also paving the ground for the Taliban to come into the government, to join the government, to be part of the government. They have even accepted them as a political party, not as warlords, not as terrorists. They're not calling them as terrorists, or they're not calling them as armed opposition, etc. So this is a big opportunity for Taliban to come. Of course, they can talk with the U.S., finish their whatever belongs to the U.S., they can talk with the U.S. But when it comes to the Afghan government, Taliban will eventually have to accept to talk with the Afghan government to make sure they agree on the peace deal and to make sure there is a durable and long-term peace in Afghanistan between the Taliban and the other parties like Jamiat-e-Islami, Hizb-e-Islami, and also the Afghan government.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Hamdullah Hamdard. That was very insightful. We will be keeping a close eye on the next escalations in this situation, so do stay tuned for that. For now, let's move on to the next story. U.S. President Donald Trump says he will consider an interim trade deal with China until a permanent pact can be reached. Now, the president's remarks come as the world's two largest economies prepare for a new round of talks to resolve their trade war. Washington and Beijing have made moves to build confidence ahead of the dialogue. China has, of course, renewed purchases of U.S. farm goods and excluded some American goods from retaliatory tariffs. President Donald Trump has reciprocated by delaying a tariff hike on Chinese goods by 2 weeks. However, Trump says he would prefer to finalize a fully fledged agreement with Beijing.
I see a lot of analysts are saying an interim deal, meaning we'll do pieces of it, the easy ones first. But there's no easy or hard. There's a deal or there's not a deal.
Over in New Zealand, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has tabled a new bill in Parliament to further tighten the country's gun laws. Now, the bill marks 6 months since the terrorist attacks on 2 mosques in Christchurch, which left 51 Muslims dead. This is New Zealand's second set of gun reforms after the government identified weak weapon laws as a key reason behind the atrocity. The bill includes the creation of a registry to monitor and track every firearm legally held in New Zealand. This also tightens rules on licensing, binding individuals to renew their licenses every 5 years instead of every 10. Now, earlier, Prime Minister Ardern said the government took action to remove semi-automatic weapons, and now it moves a step further.
Today, the government has also introduced legislation into the House that will help ensure gun ownership is restricted to responsible users and stop the flow of guns into the black market.
Now, the trial of Brenton Tarrant, who is the terrorist responsible for these attacks, will begin in June 2020. Moving on, 11 people have been killed after a boat capsized during a religious ceremony in central Indian state of Bhopal. Around 20 people had set out in a boat to immerse a huge worshipping idol in a lake near the Katlapura Ghat. Police say 5 others have been rescued while a search for survivors is underway. Madhya Pradesh State's Chief Minister Kamal Nath has ordered a high-level inquiry into the accident. Ten people have been killed in a stampede at an election campaign rally for Mozambique's President Filipe Nyusi. Hospital authorities in the city of Nampula say 98 others are being treated for injuries. They say people were crushed as they attempted to leave the election rally through a single gate. Interior Minister Basilio Monteiro says he has ordered an inquiry into the incident. Mozambique is in the midst of campaigning for general elections on October the 15th. 3 people have been killed after a storm pounded parts of eastern Spain with record rainfall. Severe weather warnings have been issued after torrential rains burst riverbanks and swept away cars. Authorities have ordered schools in Valencia and the Murcia region to close after more heavy rain was forecast. Officials have advised people in affected areas to stay indoors. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says emergency services are working to minimize the storm's effects. The National Weather Service says the regions of Valencia, Alicante and Murcia will be hit by similar storms today. With that, we're going to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. More stories to follow. Welcome back. Now, the Speaker of Britain's Parliament, John Bercow, has pledged to stop a no-deal Brexit. Bercow says he will use procedural creativity if the government tries to bulldoze a no-deal through the House of Commons. Delivering a lecture in London, Bercow said he would not be bound by any time limit or existing rules. He said the only possible Brexit is one explicitly endorsed by MPs. He said the law passed before Parliament's prorogation requires government to seek a delay in Brexit until January the 31st. The delay will stay in place unless Parliament approves a Brexit deal by October the 19th. However, Johnson said he would prefer being dead in a ditch than to ask for the EU for another delay. Now, in the United States, makeshift courts have been set up in South Texas to help process thousands of migrants from Mexico after crossing the border. U.S. Customs and Border Protection estimates 42,000 immigrants are waiting for a U.S. court date. U.S. immigration official Albert Flores says the makeshift tent courtrooms will speed up the processing of cases. A small number of migrants will appear for hearings before these courts in Laredo and Brownsville. Over 25 tent courtrooms will provide video conferencing, so judges who are away from the border can hear cases remotely. Italy has reached a deal with several EU countries to take in migrants aboard a charity ship in the Mediterranean. The Ocean Viking is carrying 82 Africans rescued in various operations off the coast of Libya. 17 minors are among the migrants on the French rescue vessel, and it is run by the NGOs SOS Mediterranean and Doctors Without Borders. Now, earlier, a pregnant woman and her husband were rescued from the ship and taken to Malta due to a medical emergency. The rescue ship is currently stranded at sea between Malta and the Italian island of Lampedusa, as Rome considered its request for a safe port. The new Italian government has promised to change its response to the migrant influx following the departure of hardline Interior Minister Matteo Salvini. Russia says it believes the war in Syria is over. In an interview, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the war is now confined to 2 areas, but not controlled by the government. Lavrov said Russia is now focused on organizing humanitarian assistance for Syrians. He said Moscow is working to establish a political process to stabilize Syria and the rest of the Middle East. Lavrov said US and EU sanctions against the Syrian government are counterproductive. Earlier, President Vladimir Putin said Russia will continue to support the Syrian government against rebels. Meanwhile, the New York Times has reported that the Pentagon is preparing to deploy 150 troops to northeast Syria. The US troops would conduct joint ground patrols with Turkish forces in a safe zone which was established to prevent a Turkish military incursion. Now, the UN has warned some 2 million people in Somalia are at risk of starving. The country is currently facing its worst drought since 2011. The UN's relief chief, Mark Lowcock, says decades of conflict and a lack of investment has exacerbated the crisis. Speaking at the end of a 2-day visit, Lowcock said droughts have become more frequent. He said erratic rains have triggered recurring floods in the country, and the UN's recent food security analysis shows the April to June harvest was the worst since 2011. Some 2.6 million people have already been displaced as a result of natural disasters. In southwest Somalia, almost 400,000 people have fled drought, terror attacks and armed conflict in the past 3 years. The UN Security Council has unanimously approved the easing of a 6-year arms embargo on the Central African Republic. French ambassador to the UN, Nicolas de Rivière, says the Security Council resolution still bars the republic from selling weapons to any third party. He said the Central African Republic must inform the UN at least 20 days in advance of any arms purchase. De Rivière said Bangui must also provide the details of their weapons and their suppliers. The UN imposed an arms embargo on the country in 2013 after rebels toppled President Francois Bozize. The world's first malaria vaccine is being administered in Kenya today. The recently developed drug has been added to Nairobi's immunization schedule for children under 2. The World Health Organization announced the vaccine 3 weeks ago. This makes Kenya the 3rd country in Africa to roll out the vaccine for a disease that kills 1 child around the world every 2 minutes. Health Minister Wekesa Masasabi says the malaria vaccine is critically important to combat the disease. Masasabi says Kenya still has an incidence of 27% malaria infection for children under 5. Kenya plans to raise awareness and roll out the vaccine to 8 countries over the next 2 years. Due to ongoing transmission, half of the world's population is still at risk of contracting malaria. And here in Pakistan, Prime Minister Imran Khan will address a rally in Azad, Jammu and Kashmir today over New Delhi's atrocities in the Indian-occupied Kashmir. Khan's rally is being held at the university ground to highlight the plight of Kashmiris after India's illegal annexation. Earlier, Khan stressed he will show the Kashmiris that Pakistan stands resolutely with them. PM Khan said the rally will send a message to the world about the continuing siege in Indian-occupied Kashmir. He will address the people of Kashmir before leaving for New York to address the UN's General Assembly. New Delhi's crushing curfew and communications blackout in the valley has entered its 40th day. Pakistan has called on the United Nations Security Council to push India to end the occupied Kashmir's lockdown. Pakistan's permanent ambassador to the UN, Dr. Maliha Lodi, says the Security Council has failed to implement its resolutions on Kashmir. Speaking in the General Assembly, she said the bloodbath in Indian-occupied Kashmir has gone unchecked for over 70 years. Ambassador Lodi said over 95,000 Kashmiris have lost their lives to brutal atrocities. She said Pakistan seeks a council that is democratic, effective and accountable to member states. Now, first up in the world of business, OPEC has agreed to trim oil output by asking overproducing members, Iraq and Nigeria, to bring production in line with their targets. The group is looking to prevent a glut amid soaring US production and a slowing global economy. Oil prices have dropped below $60 a barrel from this year's peak of $75. Prices dropped as fears of a global recession outweigh concerns about falling supply from sanctions hit Iran and Venezuela. OPEC's second largest producer, Iraq, has pledged to reduce output by 175,000 barrels a day by next month. Nigeria will reduce supply by 57,000 barrels a day. Meanwhile, Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdul Aziz bin Salman says the kingdom will continue to pump less than its target.
Between OPEC plus member countries, I would like also to declare our strong solidarity with our colleagues and the implementation of the production agreement.
US internet giant Google has agreed to pay $1 billion settlement to end a tax dispute with France. The payment comprises a fine of $503 million plus additional taxes of $514 million. The fiscal fraud probe that began 4 years ago investigated Google's non-payment of dues to France. Investigators claimed the tech giant avoided tax by not declaring parts of its activities. The payment follows similar out-of-court settlements by Google in Italy and Britain over recent years. Google says it now wants to see a coordinated reform for a clear international taxation framework. French Justice Minister Nicole Belloubet and Budget Minister Gérald Darmanin have welcomed the arrangement. Well, it's 36 degrees Celsius here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. And that was all I have from the news bulletin at the moment, but do stay tuned to Indus News for further updates. And as always, thanks for watching.